Hi, my name's Nicholas Lovejoy, and today I'm going to be interviewing my friend Leonard Shaw. He's been a psychotherapist for over 50 years, and for 25 years or more has done work in prisons with prisoners who are both survivors and perpetrators of abuse. Leonard, can you describe how you decided to work in prisons?
That is kind of interesting because in 1977 and 78 I went through a powerful transformation spiritually, and after that my work expanded and I started teaching these intensives in Toronto and Copenhagen and Frankfurt, and quite soon I had this kind of deep feeling come up inside me that I should be doing this work in prisons. So it was just kind of a calling. So I went to a prison and made a presentation to a group of inmates, and they invited me back, and I started doing 3-day and 2-day intensives 3 or 4 times a year.
Had you ever been to a prison before then, in any capacity?
I had actually, part of my graduate training was in a prison. So I have had some experience, and when I was working my way through school, I worked 3.5 years at the juvenile court, which is like a prison for young offenders.
How would you describe the process that you use when you're working with the prisoners?
Well, I told the prison I wanted friends and relatives of inmates to come, so it'd be more like my intensives on the outside. And at first they would only allow wives to come, and then after that, wives and girlfriends, and pretty soon it was everybody on their visiting list could come. So these groups were anywhere from 12, I think the largest one I had was 73. I had the chief of police from the second largest city in Denmark and his wife, who was a therapist, come. So I've had therapists from around the world come to these prison seminars. And I run them very much like the ones on the outside. I give a little psychoeducational introduction, then I have some powerful processes that help people get in touch with deep pain, and things unfold. Share in pairs, and then people that are willing take the hot seat, and I do a very deep healing process at times with them.
In your article on love and forgiveness, you refer to working with survivors and perpetrators of sexual abuse. Do you try to limit your work to the context of sexual abuse, or are you more generally interested in traumatic early childhood experiences and consequent adult misbehavior?
I actually work with anything that comes up with people. I have these processes that help people get in touch with their unfinished business, as we sometimes say as therapists. But the thing is, especially in the prisons, most of these guys had horrible things happen to them as children, and they grew up and did horrible things to other people. So it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse.
Beyond the obvious constraints of going to the prisons and working within the institutional context, how is this work different from working with other trauma survivors or other people you have helped? And how is it similar?
It's really not that much different. I mean, it's amazing. I've also had a lot of people from my private practice attend these prison seminars. Sometimes I refer to the seminars as love shock therapy. And when I'm working with someone and they're really stuck, no matter how we work with their material, their psychodynamics, they just, they don't seem to be getting beyond their stuck point. And after going through one of these prison intensives, sometimes they heal things without even talking about them. I remember one man just had this harshness towards his stepson, and no matter how we worked on it, I did family therapy, I did family of origin work with him, somehow he couldn't get over this harshness with his stepson. He came to a prison seminar, never talked about it, never worked on it, and it just softened his heart tremendously towards his stepson. They got along so much better after that. So I guess the biggest difference is a much higher percentage of people had horrible traumatic experiences in their childhood in prison. And in the work I do outside the prison, it's a much smaller percentage of the group. You know, it goes from like 92% to 9% or something like that.
Right.
But it's amazing how similar it is, and people from the outside that go to these groups, a lot of times they have this attitude ahead of time like, well, the bad folks are over there in prison, you know, and by the time the 2 or 2.5 days of love shock therapy are over with, they just feel like, these guys are my brothers. It's quite powerful and quite optimistic.
Describe what you've gotten out of working in prisons. How has this informed the rest of your work with clients on the outside?
Well, I mentioned that within a short period of time of this transformation in my own growth as a therapist, I had this calling to be in prison.
Right.
And one part of me thought, well, this is kind of a noble thing to do, and aren't I nice to go into prison and blah, blah, blah. But it was so validating of this work. It was such a powerful validation of, at the deepest level, all negative behavior comes from fear, and underneath that fear, we're all brothers and sisters. So this kind of love and forgiveness work that I do, when it was so validated by this prison work, it just gave me a great foundation and a very peaceful confidence to just go out into the world and teach. So it really grounded me and validated me as a therapist in terms of this spiritually based Gestalt therapy that I do.
You've said that your work in prisons has drawn some criticism from some quarters, including that one criticism along the lines that prisoners don't deserve it, that they should be punished, not helped. And the other that it is dangerous, irresponsible, and unfair to ask a survivor of abuse to step into the shoes of the perpetrator. How would you address those criticisms?
The first one, even some of the inmates have been critical of my work there. That, the general population tends to feel like, okay, these are the bad guys, we'll just put them in a prison and lock them up. And they don't deserve any kind of treatment or therapy or being nice to them. But I really liked, it's funny, when I was at Monroe, the associate warden of custody was actually more humane than the associate warden of treatment. It was the associate warden of custody who said something I'll never forget. He said, these men are here for punishment. No, he said, these men are here as punishment. They are not here for punishment. Like just being in prison is punishment enough. Once they're here, we don't need to continue punishing them. So I really liked his attitude. I wished he was the associate warden of treatment. But actually, there isn't that much treatment going on in our prisons. Also, part of the spiritual foundation of the work is we're all brothers and sisters. And I remember one inmate walking out of my presentation saying, "You're trying to tell me the warden's my brother? What a bunch of bleep that is." And he walked out. And then another time a guy walked out because I was doing some very humane healing work with a sex offender. And he felt like we shouldn't be doing anything constructive or nice or helpful or healing to sex offenders. So there is ambivalence in our society about helping people in prison or being nice to them or helping them feel better about themselves.
What about the aspect that it's dangerous or irresponsible?
Yes, some therapists feel that it's unfair, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible, it's gonna make the survivor of this sexual or violent abuse, going to make them more vulnerable or make them disintegrate or whatever. It is true that you can't just take this work and just apply it like a prescription to everyone who's ever been abused. It does have to unfold intuitively and organically out of your interaction with the person. But what's interesting about people criticizing this specific aspect of the work, putting yourself deeply in the shoes of the perpetrator, because that's what's so dramatically healing about the work. When these inmates put themselves deeply in the shoes of the person that almost killed them or raped them or beat them up or beat up their sister or whatever they were, when they put themselves deeply in the shoes of that perpetrator, this kind of, it's almost like a spontaneous heart connection develops and a spontaneous forgiveness develops, and it changes their relationship with that person. And I've actually seen the fruits of that in their parents coming to visit more often, or having a more harmonious relationship, or phone conversations going much better. The inmate feeling more relaxed and comfortable when talking about his family, or having more of a heartfelt feeling when talking about his family, because usually it's somebody in the family that has abused them physically or psychologically or sexually. But I've had people who were sexually abused come as participants from the outside to the seminar and relive some of their sexual abuse. And when they put themselves deeply in the shoes of the person that assaulted them, once again this deep healing takes place inside of them. I worked with one woman who had horrible sexual abuse by her father, and she had tried all kinds of therapy. She was like, I don't know, 45 or 47 or something, and she still felt terrible about it and terribly unfinished, unhealed. And the way the work goes is you first relive your traumatic experience as yourself with ing verbs like it's happening right now. Then there's a little more process that they do. And then they relive it as the perpetrator. She relived it first as herself, and then she relived it as her father. And then they dialogue. I have them play both halves of the conversations, just a common Gestalt tool. And eventually, this dialogue, and sometimes they need a little guidance or coaching, this dialogue reaches a place where they have a heart connection. Doesn't condone what the person did, doesn't mean it is okay. I mean, that's another criticism, that this
Right.
would condone what they're, it doesn't condone this violent, abusive act. But this woman told me the next day, when she came to the intensive the next day, that she had a peacefulness about her father that she didn't know was possible. It was just, the work was a huge relief to her. So that very aspect that people feel is dangerous and irresponsible is what is so healing for people.
I'd like you to describe the spiritual aspect of your work in prisons.
It's all spiritual to me. I mean, that's what happened to me in 1977 and 78. I just realized that we're all connected, not only to each other, but to everything. One of my teachers used to say, Sid Banks used to say, you're part of the energy of all things. And so after that year of struggling with this spiritual wisdom and finally having this big ego death where I completely surrendered to it, and that was interesting. I went from feeling like I was a Gestalt expert to feeling like this spiritual toddler. It was just like every day was a new beginning after that. And all of my work just became more heartfelt and more spiritual, and it gave me, I don't know, kind of an anchor and a guidance that my work just became healing at a much deeper level. So it all feels, I mean, I hope that's not too airy-fairy for people, but it all feels spiritual, like the basis of everything I do. Even when I'm not working, it just seems like it has a spiritual foundation to it that takes a lot of the stress out of life.
You've mentioned that the specific abuses that prisoners have endured in their childhood sometimes serve as the templates for their crimes as adults. Can you elaborate on that?
When these guys relive their childhood trauma, they very often end up realizing that the way they were abused as children becomes a template for their crime. Their MO, as we like to say. So this has happened several times. One guy was horribly punished by his father for playing doctor with a girl next door. And when he was reliving his crime, he realized the way I rape and humiliate women is exactly, I mean, his father didn't rape him, but it was a psychological rape, is exactly the way my father abused me as a child. Another guy was reliving being molested by his uncle. And he was going along reliving the experience, and all of a sudden he just kind of like something stunned him. And I've noticed this happening with the guys when they work, and I said, "What just happened?" And he said, "I just realized the way I molest children is exactly the way my uncle molested me." Now, for him to say that I molest children is a dangerous thing to do in a prison, because sex offenders are considered scum of the earth by other inmates. So that's the other thing about these intensives. The inmates became so open in them. But what was really startling about what this guy said was there was a man in the group who was in prison for killing the man that molested his children. And he turns to this guy and says, "I just want you to know I love you and I'm here for you if you need to talk about this." So that's how loving these intensives get. It was amazing. And some of the inmates would say, they would just gesture towards the group and say, they say, "This is the loving family I never had as a child." So the groups had a huge impact on me. And I couldn't go through one of those intensives without crying. They're so deeply moving. Another guy who he wouldn't participate, he wouldn't do any of the exercises, he wouldn't even sit in the circle. We have this big circle. He would sit outside the circle, about 10 feet outside the circle, with his girlfriend. And I thought he just came because he could sit beside his girlfriend and the food was good. Because originally they would let me bring in food. In the visiting room, they can't sit alongside their wife or girlfriend. They have to sit at 90-degree or 180-degree angles to them. So I thought he was just there for the food and hanging out right next to his girlfriend. But he would always come to the intensives. And after coming for about a year, he spoke up one day. And he said, "I was about to throw somebody off the tier the other day. And I thought of you people and I couldn't do it." Because in prison, if you want to kill somebody, you just throw them off the tier. It's 3 stories to cement. And this guy had huge biceps, even though he was a very short man. He could have easily thrown somebody off the tier. So it really broadened my consciousness about the impact of these groups. I thought he was there for completely selfish reasons and not that interested in what we were doing or talking about, but it had a huge impact on him. If he thought of us and couldn't throw this guy off the tier.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the spiritual aspect, you've mentioned that sometimes the larger the group, or doing this work in groups, is a lot more effective than doing it individually or with just a few people in the room. I'd like you to touch on that. What is, and what have you noticed with small groups compared to large groups? Does this tie into the spiritual aspect that you're talking about?
It does. And the larger the group, the more it can make it scarier for someone to get vulnerable. But at the same time, if they are willing to get vulnerable, having 40 or 50 or 70 people focusing their loving attention on you when you're doing some healing work, it really ups the voltage of the work. I mean, it makes it a much more intense, deep healing experience when you're doing this work with 70 people focusing their care and love and support on you. And after they've done the work, sometimes they feel vulnerable or exposed or whatever. I have them look around in people's eyes and, they just see all this love and support in people's eyes. So it's a very powerful experience. Anything else?
I was just thinking the same thing. Is there anything else that you wanted to say with regards to your prison work?
Well, we can talk about it, and I can give you this heartfelt sharing of what it was like. But it's still, I still feel there's more to it than I can even convey in words or emotions. There's something, even though people are using coarse language and they're describing horrible things, you almost feel like you're in church or something, or in one of nature's beautiful cathedrals.
Sounds like there's a realness to it that is
It's
maybe absent in other circumstance.
It's very real, that's for sure. I mean, some of these guys had their father put a gun in their mouth as a form of discipline and pull the trigger, and the guy says, when that gun went click, my life changed forever. And yet, when he relived it first as himself and then as his father and had this dialogue, he had this peaceful heart connection with his father that he never had before. So it's hard to describe, but it's a very spiritual experience. And it's a very beautiful experience, which sounds kind of odd when you're dealing with really horrible things.
Mm-hmm. How long has it been that you've stopped working in prisons?
Well, at my age I lose track of time, but it's probably 3 years or so that I last worked there.
Do you miss it?
Some of the guys that had been at Monroe have been transferred to a special commitment center, and these are guys that are considered so dangerous that when they finish their prison sentence, they rearrest them in the parking lot. This seems kind of cruel to me. They don't even tell them that they're going to do this. They rearrest them in the parking lot, take them to a judge, they get a psychiatric commitment, and they go to something they don't call a prison, but it has high walls with razor wire. Theoretically, they're supposed to be able to work their way out of there, but only 2 or 3 guys have ever done that. This is also a very controversial aspect of Washington law, that they even are doing this. Well, they called me up and asked me if I would come out and do one of my intensives there. And I said I would do one. But it was so moving, I just had to go back. So I can't remember how many I did out there, 3 or 4, maybe more, before I finally stopped. But it's deeply moving work. And the other thing is, it gives me energy. I'm a basketball junkie. I play basketball 5 days a week. That's why my finger is so screwed up. And I would do a 3-day seminar at Monroe, and I'd come home on Sundays and go play basketball across the street, you know, with these teenagers and 20-year-olds, because it drained me in one way, but it was such a good way. It also gave me energy. I wish some of those seminars were videotaped. I think if the general public saw these guys doing this work, it would change significantly people's attitudes. And the other thing I want to say is, it chaps my hide, as they say, that we cut Head Start programs, because it really costs us a lot more in our prisons when we cut Head Start programs. The care and support and education and nourishment that kids get in Head Start programs. I mean, somebody figured it out once. For every $1 you spend in Head Start, you save $9 in prisons. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's about all I have to say.
Well, Leonard, I want to thank you for your time today, but especially thank you for the work you've been doing to, I think it's fair to say, try and heal some of our society's deepest wounds. And I think we all benefit from that, since we are all connected.
Thanks. Appreciate your interest.
Thanks for watching.